Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our weekly show Global Debate, where we bring you detailed analysis of key and important global issues. Today, we're going to talk about the global supply chain crisis. Now, the global supply chains are networks that can span across multiple continents and countries for the purpose of sourcing and supplying goods and services. Now, these chains involve the flow of information, processes, and resources across the globe. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to various hurdles in the global supply chain system. Congestion at ports in the US, Europe, and Asia has disrupted sailing schedules and equipment shortage, particularly in exporting countries, and has created breaks in supply chains. Now, according to the OECD, higher commodity prices and global shipping costs are currently adding 1.5% to inflation across G20 nations. By December, it could be up by 1.75% and further up by 1% in 2022. OECD also estimates that the drag from the pandemic and supply bottlenecks is unlikely to ease in this year, that is 2021. Recently, US President Joe Biden also hosted a summit on strengthening global supply chains on the sidelines of the G20 summit, where participants decided to focus on transparency, security, sustainability, diversity, openness, and predictability in order to overcome the challenges on this aspect. In this week's episode of Global Debate, we will discuss and analyze various aspects of this particular issue, the challenges therein vis-a-vis the global supply chain crisis, and how those challenges can be overcome. And to understand all these issues in a much better way, we are joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Ms. Gul E. Kremer. She's joining us. She's Wilkinson Professor, Iowa State University. Mr. P. Easwaran Subramanian is also joining us, Partner and Leader for Supply Chain at Deloitte, India. Dr. Rajesh Chadha, Senior Fellow with CSEP, is also with us, and so is Victor Stolzenburg. He's a Research Economist at the World Trade Organization. Welcome, all of you, to Sansad Television. Let me begin by, trying to understand the entire scope of the problem here. And let me start with you, Ms. Kremer. Let's understand where the problem lies, where are the bottlenecks, what are the hurdles when we talk about the global supply chain crisis?
First of all, good evening to you all, and thank you for inviting me for this very important session. What you're asking is a rather big question. In fact, at this time, we do have many issues. And if I were to start with a minor analogy on this, think about a global supply chain as a number of people coming to a potluck. But what is happening is that, one of them either forgets the drinks, or a few of them are late, and eventually the meal is not, in place, and nobody's enjoying any of the goodies that people are going to be bringing, right? So we are, in fact, right at that moment.
Okay.
What is happening is logistics, whatever the line is, they are failing, they are not connecting, many issues with that. Sometimes, health concerns, other concerns, workforce issues. This whole pandemic obviously impacted the workforce across different nations. Fear about the contamination for different things, how do we protect our borders, from this pandemic. Also related to within our surrounding, within our states, what is happening is the volatility in the supply and demand also started impacting the workforce issues. I'm waiting for components. I'm not able to have my workers go ahead and assemble the pieces, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm losing money at home in many different ways.
Okay.
It's a major problem. It's a potluck that we are not able to have.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the workforce issue is a larger issue that has been aggravated further by the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Mr. Easwaran, I'd like to bring you in here. Would you agree to that aspect when we are trying to look at the global supply chain management? And it has various components. It's a complex process. So obviously, if one thing goes wrong, there will be an effect on the other aspects of this process as well, and then the entire system, the entire supply chain will feel the effect and will eventually crumble.
A couple of things that, and I think excellent points that were mentioned earlier. I think a couple of points for us to note. I think till the early 2020s, when the pandemic struck, I think most aspects for supply chain were governed by a cost consideration. And therefore, you had a significant concentration of supply, which was obviously across geographies, but I think there was significant concentration, and therefore the demand was much dispersed. And as you started this discussion, you talked about dimensions of sustainability, you talked about dimensions of diversity, as well as dispersion and therefore reliability in the process. These are new aspects which are now taking shape post the pandemic. Therefore, I think one of the big things that are coming to the fore, which is also in a state of flux, as we talk about disruptions, is the fact that many concentrated supply chains are now getting into a dispersion mode. So that's point number one for us to note. Mm-hmm. The second is the biggest dilemma that countries and companies are going through is dispersion comes with a cost. So, you spoke about resilience. Resilience comes with a cost, but has a long-term impact on how organizations can work. Therefore, I think one of the biggest things that companies are trying to work, and therefore countries given the competitive advantages that they have on specific portfolios, are also looking at how do they solve this, what to do in the short term versus what to do in the medium term. So that's a second one, which is also driving a lot of collaboration between countries that we are able to see now. The third one, and possibly the last one, is that I think we also have the dimension of sustainability now coming in. So it's not just about reliability and integrity of supply and therefore the dispersion that we spoke about. I think we now also have the ownership of the environment, which is coming in place, and the ownership of the society as far as supply chains are concerned. So if you take all these three in consideration now, I think that is where the big decisions are getting made. Okay. Unfortunately, I think we are dealing with a very near-term set of demand and supply synchronization, which is where you're talking about container shortages, semiconductor shortages, and potential aluminum shortages, etc. So this is how I think the problem is getting, really framed, and these are some of the areas that countries and companies are looking at to address the problem.
Okay. Let me also bring in Victor here from the WTO. Victor, in your views, how big is the problem here, and how big is the challenge, given the fact that the impact of these bottlenecks in the global supply chain management system is being felt across the globe, across the continents, both in terms of producers as well as consumers?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, it's certainly a really big problem, as Gul and Easwaran have pointed out. In a way, we are here in a perfect storm where a lot of different factors come together and lead to a severe dysynchronization between supply and demand. I think the good thing is, at least to us, it looks like it's a temporary problem. Because we think one factor that hasn't been mentioned so much is that this is partly also a demand-driven story. And insofar as there's an upshot in the whole story, it is that policymakers learned their lessons from the global financial crisis, which was followed by austerity and not too much demand pushing policies. And this time we had a very different response to the crisis, to the pandemic. We had a lot, at least in advanced economies, a lot of large fiscal packages that basically went into pushing up demand, mm-hmm. and this was not foreseen by companies because it's quite unexpected that in the middle of the pandemic you essentially have unexpected surges in demand. The pandemic coupled this with a drop in services demand because a lot of services are still restricted, travel, but also restaurants, hospitalism, and so on. And this essentially has led to a surge in demand of durable goods, which depend on supply chains. This was not foreseen. and therefore we have these problems right now. But as far as we know, in the course of next year, this should get better as we get the pandemic under control.
Okay. Dr. Chadha, I'd like to bring you in here as well. And would you agree with that aspect? Obviously, we're talking about where the bottlenecks are, what are the hurdles, but also from the perspective of how long will it last, as Victor was pointing, and as the OECD estimates also show, even WTO's reports also indicate that we will have to, deal with it or live with it at least till the end of 2021, maybe a bit of a spillover in the first few months of 2022 as well. Will that be enough time frame for us to tide over the challenges here?
Thank you for getting me here. And I think I agree with most of the points that have been mentioned. But to bring in context, I think apart from being a short-term phenomena that we are talking about, what would happen in next 6 months or maybe 1 year, firstly, we should be very mindful of yet another wave showing up in one country or another and what kind of lockdowns are going to remain. But that's a short-term issue. From my point of view, I think when we are discussing the global supply chains, this has kind of shown up in a longer term scenario. As you know, that this relates to the international trade on which we work a lot. All of us probably have worked on, and we have somebody from WTO. The story is about the shifting production platforms from high wage economies to low wage economies. And the flying is model, which says that the production platforms will keep shifting to the low wage economies, provided they have the facilitating policies.
Okay.
So in my view, I think it has to be looked at a holistic manner, in the sense that now that many countries are getting affected, so how vast is the impact? How long it is going to be, whether it is going to be over in 6 months or so. So it's very important to see the issue of if we are going to the country levels, if we are not only talking about the advanced countries or the very poor countries, the countries that have not been able to establish their presence in the global supply chains are also getting affected in various manners, including demand and the supply shocks.
Okay.
So I think holistic view is the understanding of the process of splintering of the production processes. And here, last point I would like to add is that the issue is of relation to the global value chains, where the value is being added in the production process, whether it is goods and services.
Okay.
I think I'll stop here.
Okay. Those two are very key points there, which you made, Dr. Chadha, in terms of splintering of production process and the global value chain also. Ms. Kremer, I'd like to ask you, vis-a-vis these 2 points, and also as both Dr. Chadha and Victor was also referring to, in terms of how long will it last is a key question when we are trying to find solutions to these hurdles or challenges vis-a-vis the global supply chain management, because we'll have to look at it from both short-term and long-term perspective.
I think that's the million-dollar question of the day, right? And I will look at it. I will try to respond to it in 2 different ways. One is the obvious one. The minute we can get the pandemic under control, I think we are going to start healing in our global supply chains. I think that's number one. And that immediately will impact the workforce. They're going to come back to work. We will not have these workforce shortages, which will then support the production. We will start, seeing the engine of the manufacturing, move and then connect the logistics and everything else.
Okay.
I also have to bring the issue of risk, identifying risk, and what was different this time versus all the other times that we have seen. Allow me to connect it this way. We always had risk in global supply chains. There's the natural risk, not knowing the location in different ways, not specifically, observing the production of this one component and how it's going to impact your product. Of course, we do a lot of supplier qualification, but there are things that you are not going to be able to handle.
Okay.
The difference is that this time, everybody was almost impacted at the same time. The risk location was not isolated. The companies did not have options. We were all impacted at the same time. And so maybe you're going to say this will not occur again in the same way. We are going to be more prepared. But I'm going to say that we have to become better as companies and those who are advising companies in terms of identifying risk and preparing for those vulnerabilities because of those risks.
Okay.
I hope I'm just beginning to respond to this question, but this will require support, protection by even local governments, federal governments. This is very important.
Okay. Okay, indeed, that's a very important aspect. And Mr. Easwaran, do you agree with what Ms. Kremer is pointing out here, that yes, there are various variables when we're talking about the global supply chain, and anything can go wrong there. The COVID pandemic seemingly has complicated the process further, made it worse. But to find solutions, we will have to look at the basics of global supply chain.
Absolutely. No, I think one interesting point that she made is the fact that companies and countries didn't have options, because this is possibly the first time that everybody was impacted at the same period of time. And therefore, I think otherwise we would have gone through the traditional model of shift of facilities and therefore tried to sort of even out demand and supply. I think one important lesson from this, and to what you just now mentioned, is that what it has also done is it has actually reoriented some of the supply chain operating models. For example, the entire definition of delivery and therefore the increase in the direct to customer models have substantially improved in the post-pandemic era. And therefore, what it meant is lesser footprint for companies to serve customers, but a larger set of technological interventions to do that. So I think on one side, I think the physical ecosystem for supply chain is something that companies are now reorienting themselves to, with all the demand and supply shortages that we are talking about. But at the same time, I think there are also some lessons that have come in, and therefore some new ways of looking at the entire end-to-end operating model itself. So I think the whole journey for organizations, and which is where I think a lot of country level interventions would be very relevant, is because at this point of time, I think the companies are really looking at changing the way in which they would do business in the post-pandemic era, not just from the pure process of conversion and manufacturing, but the larger end-to-end value chain participation. So to that extent, I think a lot of country interventions and therefore collaboration between countries will become very relevant. So that's where I see this direction coming.
Okay. Victor, do you agree there that not only the fundamentals will have to be made more strong, but also we'll have to think out of the box with newer technologies coming into picture, and also the way the pandemic has taught us various lessons?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think also what Dr. Chadha pointed out to, when we look at this holistically, we see that we are in a time when consumer demand is changing. There's higher demand for sustainability, for inclusion, and all of this in a way is not completely new, but it's to some extent new to supply chain organization. And if you couple this with the new risk assessment that comes from the pandemic, obviously you have a lot of changes coming into play for supply chain managers. And technology is advancing. I think there will be a lot of turmoil also with respect to the impact on labor markets. Mm-hmm. And it will be interesting to see how this plays out. And this is, of course, something that will be with us long after the pandemic.
Okay, fair enough. This will be there in terms of the challenges because there are other variables as well. Dr. Chadha, your concluding comments in terms of, the solutions which we are trying to find to this overall problem. We've looked at various aspects, try to understand the reasons behind the problem which we are facing right now vis-a-vis the global supply chain crisis. But when we have to look at the solutions as well, as Ms. Kremer was also pointing out and Mr. Easwaran was also referring to, we will have to look at both short-term and long-term aspect. You also mentioned in your first response there.
Yeah, I think the solutions are not going to be easy, but I think the solutions are going to be somewhat what we have been discussing in various academic fora, WTO, and other international organizations, there needs to be a lot more cooperation across countries. Number one, that we need to talk to each other much more. There has to be a clear transparency between two things or across two things. Firstly, that each country has to be clear about the deeper set of domestic policy reforms, which are transparent and conducive to letting the global supply chains mature in respective countries, whether it is goods or services, whether it is manufacturing or services. The second thing is very important, where international cooperation is required. And international cooperation again goes back to telling us about issues of transparency across the trade frontiers that are being neglected. Okay. And my third point here, sustainability, which you spoke in your introductory, in your introduction. I'll go back to COP26, let's say. Climate change is a big issue, we all know. Green technologies need to be there. So if we want to restrict to one example, let's say if we need more solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, we need critical minerals. And critical minerals, for example, I limit myself to lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. If you remember, 2010, China suspended exports of rare earths to Japan for 2 months. And there was a maritime skirmish and the prices went sky high. Tsunami in Japan in 2011 affected titanium-based car paint, and the entire world car painting was affected. 2020, last year, Indonesia banned exports of nickel ore. So what I'm saying is that if these issues are not kind of taken into account, then we are in trouble. Because if you see, China produces 58% of the rare earth elements, Congo 70% cobalt, Australia 55% of lithium. So I think unless the other countries which have supply chains or value addition to these minerals, critical minerals, likewise, there are issues relating to buyer-driven and producer-driven global supply chains. So I think it is a holistic solution, cannot be. And one of the things is that trade discipline is very important. I would like to end with saying back to Geneva and discuss trade more in a more disciplined manner.
Okay. Obviously, the trade discipline is important, and so is, the other aspect of international cooperation and transparency. Thank you so much, Dr. Chadha, Ms. Kremer, as well as Mr. Easwaran and Victor there also for sharing your views and inputs with us and our viewers on this very important and key global issue, the issue of a global debate, something which is being talked about across the globe right now, that is the global supply chain crisis and how that crisis can be tackled. What are the reasons behind that? We'll come back again next week with a different global issue. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.